MDF, good morning from over here. 04:30 precisely in the morning over here, and I've had a nice sleep, and I'm really looking forward to getting back to these readings again. You were really kind in what you said, and I'm glad that they provide some sort of placid. I don't mind being background noise. That's kind of what they are. Um, so I'm going to try to read you something at a reasonable length this morning. So do feel free to shut this off if you've got important things to do, as I'm sure that you have. I'm just checking that I've got everything around me in the correct place. Yep, light is up bad. Legs are more or less in a comfortable position. Just stretching around a bit. Oh, God, you got full bloody. Trying to find the best angle so that my face isn't too shiny, and the growing horror of my double chin is not too grotesque. It is a matter of lighting. I now know, and I now understand why actresses, or actors even, yes, worry about this so much. It's from with a certain lighting, it looks huge, and in other lights it can, well, not exactly disappear, sadly. But yeah, I know I'm being vain. So I'll stop being vain. And I'll get my cluttered thoughts in order. And yawn, and I shall have a big swig of coffee before I start. Nothing exciting on this mug today, I'm afraid. It's purely a functional mug. And I am delighted, really delighted beyond. Honestly, sentences, John. Think in sentences, okay? I am delighted more than words can say that this arrived yesterday, and I am really, really happy. And how amazing is the Australian Postal Service to get this over here, I think in 4 days. I've even put a little video up on Facebook of my opening the package it came in. That's how excited I was. Because I do want to read this to you. I think you will like it. I'm sorry to have put A River Town on hold for a while. I'm sure Mr. Keneally will not be offended, because I'm sure that he has read and loved this as much as I did. And it's also a nice big paperback size, which means bigger print, which is good because it means I can read it more easily. So if you're comfortable, as I hope you are, and I am comfortable, which, yeah, I am, I'll start reading A Curious Intimacy by Jessica White. And I'm sure this is in breach of several of UK and Australia's copyright laws. I did used to know rather a lot about copyright law, and I have perhaps mercifully forgotten all of it, and I'm not going to get into that right now. I kind of don't think there should be a copyright law of books that are out of print and inaccessible, which this unfortunately is at the moment. But then again, I suppose that if person X buys a painting for $5 million and he or she wishes to shut it up in a room with the curtains closed and allow nobody to see it, then that's the right that the person has under UK, Australian, Commonwealth, whatever, property laws. And there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, my defence, should Jessica quite rightly object, is that I am intending to disseminate her talent and introduce it to as wide an audience as possible, and hope that this may generate sales for future publications. Sadly, intentions, good or bad, don't really matter in copyright law. It's very much a binary process. I said I wasn't going to think about that, and I'm not. Starting to yawn already. Jesus, that's boring. Okay, no more yawning. No more waffling about legal matters that I no longer know about. Chapter 1. The coolness of the Jarrah forest stippled my skin with goosebumps. Birds sprang into flight in the branches above me, calling their last notes before they settled for the evening. I was anxious to find water before nightfall, and I knew that the Blackwood River was close by. Letting Thistle carry me on, I half closed my eyes for a moment. I was exhausted from several nights of broken sleep, and my injured foot throbbed. The pain no longer troubled me, but I was concerned that, were I to be attacked again, I would be unable to escape. I blinked up at the trees that towered over me protectively. The stable hand at the property near Augusta had talked of men felling the Kari for timber. Fit for paving the streets of London, they'd say. They say, sorry. He'd grinned, handing over flour and salted meat. Half his teeth were missing, but he had a bright and lively face. His mistress had sneered on seeing me, a woman in trousers, and had turned back into the house. But the boy, happy for company, hadn't been perturbed. "These are for your mistress," I'd said, dropping coins into his hand. "And this one is for you." The boy had smiled widely then, and given me an extra bag of oats for Thistle. He'd murmured to the horse, his hands running over Thistle's neck almost like a lover's. I moved my gaze from the trees overhead and shivered, remembering the man at Augusta again. I imagined his odour was still on my skin. I'd been asleep for an hour, dreaming of Helena, when his boot jabbed my ribs, jolting me awake. I heard a rough, slurred voice. "Get up! You're trespassing!" I reached for my gun, which I always kept beside me as I slept, and then heard a click. It was in the man's hands, and he had cocked it. "If you don't leave now, I'll be using this." I smelled alcohol and old perspiration. Carefully, I pushed myself up and turned towards the smell and the voice. Among the shadows of the trees, I could just perceive a stocky man with a heavy beard. When I met his eyes, he fired the gun. Startled, I stepped back, and my foot landed on something sharp. Cockatoos screeched in the trees, and when he lunged at me, my screams joined theirs. He slapped his hand across my mouth to silence me, and I bit into his fingers. He weakened momentarily, and I thrust him from me. Confused with alcohol, he lost his balance and stumbled to the ground. I viciously returned his kick, and while he curled up in pain, I found rope in my pack and bound his wrists and feet. I spat out his blood, pulled on my boots with shaking hands, and gathered up my swag: provisions, specimen boxes, vasculum, and the gun, carrying them to the horses. But only Thistle stood behind the tree. "Where's the pack horse?" I hissed, furious. But there was no point searching for him, as I had no light and might have become lost. My heart pounding, I saddled Thistle and strapped the extra packages to him, then set off back along the stream to the homestead with the gap-toothed boy. I knocked loudly on the wooden door and tried to swallow, but my throat was parched. A man in a nightshirt and trousers opened the door holding a lamp. He looked startled when he saw my riding pants. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I've been attacked, and I hoped you could offer me a bed for the night." He frowned suspiciously. "Where are you from? Don't you live near here?" "I'm from Adelaide. I got off the ship at Albany, and I've been travelling." The man said I was trespassing. Then he fired a gun at me. "Oh, that's Mad Harry Murphy." He sounded exasperated. The mistress appeared at his shoulder, clutching a shawl at her neck. "Who is it, John?" she asked warily. "Harry Murphy attacked her. She wants to stay here for the night." The woman peered at me. "You were here 2 days ago?" "Yes." She exchanged a glance with her husband, and said slowly, "Don't see why not." "I'd better go and find him. The coppers have been trying to catch him for more than a year, since he escaped from prison." "He won't have gone far," I said. "I bound his wrists and feet. He's just 2 miles downstream." The man's frown deepened as he stared at me. He turned to his wife. "I'll take Jack with me. We'll have to get this madman off to Perth." He disappeared into the darkness of the house. His wife stared, appraising me, then said, "Come with me. You can stay in the servants' quarters." "Thank you." My shoulders sagged with relief. She pushed open the door to a rough mud shack and roused a girl sleeping on the bed. I was too numb to listen to their exchange. nor to mind the heavy smell of the straw mattress. When her mistress left, the girl went back to sleep, and I peeled off my clothes. My foot throbbed insistently, but I was too weak from shock to examine it. By morning, the pain in my foot had worsened. In the weak light, I found that I had cut the sole, probably upon a sharp rock. The servant had gone. I could hear her sweeping down the veranda. The sour smell of Harry Murphy hung upon the clothes that I tossed on the floor. So I pulled a clean bodice and skirt from my pack. When the mistress saw me properly attired, her manner softened. As I ate a breakfast of beef and bread, she explained, "Harry Murphy shoots at everyone. Black and white, it makes no difference. He's up for murder, 3 of them. That's why they have to take him to Perth, to set him before the magistrate." When I had swallowed down a cup of tea, I thanked the woman, saddled Thistle, and continued north. I was in constant dread of the man rushing out of the bush, and could not concentrate on looking for flowers. Bird calls, the snapping of twigs, rustles in the undergrowth, all sounds which had previously soothed me, were now alarming. In the early evening, I set up camp by a secluded stream. I undressed and scrubbed my skin until it smarted, then used the rest of the soap on the soiled clothes, spreading them out over a Hibertia shrub to dry. Despite my tiredness, I found it difficult to sleep. When the sun broke through the trees, I rose, but my head still felt cloudy. I saddled Thistle and pressed on. After several days of riding, my confidence began to return, but my injured foot made dismounting difficult. I walked beside Thistle, comforted by his warmth, and picked heads of tricorn elatior, the yellow autumn lily, and placed them in my vasculum. When fatigue overwhelmed me, I climbed back onto Thistle, and I fought to keep my eyes open. Abruptly, the jarrah trees began to thin, and through them I saw cleared hills, dry and brown, rising from the road. The light of the setting sun hit my cheeks as I left the bush behind. A track branched from the road to a gate, then dipped down to a creek that twisted and curved towards the river. It appeared to be a quick way of getting to the water, so I turned Thistle onto the track. The gate hadn't been opened for some time, and dirt was shored up against its base. I lifted it over the hillock of soil, and the splintered wood snatched at my palm. As I led Thistle through, I noticed there was a large house in the distance, at the end of another track leading from the creek. I decided to see if the owner of the house was home, as I didn't want to take any chances by trespassing again. In the empty creek, the stones were grey, and the trees were shedding their leaves like tears. The track curled around the hill and the homestead. It was a stately building, enclosed by a veranda, and then by a white fence. A large peppermint tree grew by the gate. A sulky propped up against it. I tethered Thistle to the fence, noticing a sign hanging from it, which read, "Avonlea." The garden was crammed with roses, many of them wilting, their stems jostled by weeds. I was surprised that they were not long dead, given the severity of the drought. A fat dog appeared at the side of the house and ran across the garden barking. I opened the gate and bent down, offering him my hand. He looked like a kelpie, his leaf-shaped ears cocked inquisitively, his small black eyes blinking. His wet nose touched my fingers as he sniffed them, and when his tail began to wag, I stroked his head. I approached the house, pain flaring through my injured foot as I mounted the steps to the veranda. To my left, set against the wall, were half-barrels containing fuchsias and pink hydrangeas. At my right stood a wicker chair, a pale blue shawl hanging over its arm. I knocked again. A little distance from the chair lay a tattered book. I hobbled over and picked it up. It was Charlotte Yonger's The Heir of Redcliffe. The black cloth cover had buckled and many of the pages were torn and chewed, probably by the dog. I placed the book on the chair and wandered around the side of the house, brushing against a cluster of maidenhair ferns that had survived in the shade. The dog followed me. Out the back was a vegetable garden. A woman was standing in it, grasping a broken garden fork in one hand and staring at the ground. The dog ran up to her, but she paid him no attention. "Hello," I called. "I knocked on the door, but there was no answer." The woman glanced up. A dirty bodice and skirt hung from her thin frame. She wore no hat, and her long blonde hair was untied and greasy, her face sunburnt and her lips cracked. Her eyes, a brilliant blue, were glassy. Yet, despite her dishevelment, she held herself well. Her wrists were slender, her cheekbones high, the skin of her neck smooth. "Hello," I said again gently. "My name is Ingrid Markham. I'm a botanist, and I'm travelling through this area, looking for plants. I'd like to camp by the river for the night. May I continue riding through this property?" The woman dropped the fork and pressed her hands to her lips. Her nails were broken and rimmed with dirt. There was a silver wedding band on her left hand. "Would I be able to talk to your husband, please?" She squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head. Tears seeped from beneath her eyelids. My instinct was to put my arms around the poor creature, but she looked so unwell that I couldn't determine how she'd react. "I'm sorry," she said finally, taking a hoarse breath. "I have forgotten myself completely." She had an educated English accent. She wiped her eyes with the heel of a hand. "I'm sorry," she repeated, and stretched out her hand. "Ellen Ives." She gripped my fingers tightly. Carefully, I withdrew them. "Would you like a cup of tea?" she asked. What I really wanted was to set up camp before nightfall. But the woman perturbed me. "Just one cup?" she asked. "I should be glad of the company." "Well, perhaps a quick one," I conceded. Mrs. Ives smiled. I followed her up the steps to the house, the dog sniffing my boot. I supposed he could smell the wound. "What's your dog's name?" I asked. The torn hem of Mrs. Ives' skirt trailed on the boards. Fletcher, she replied over her shoulder. The kitchen floor, paved with stone, had not been swept for some time. Dead beetles and onion skin surrounded the stove. Pots hung from hooks on the walls, but just as many stood on the large table in the centre of the room. I glanced inside one. It was sprouting furry mould. Two large windows looked out onto the bush and let in a great deal of light, though the panes were grimy. Beyond the whitewashed outbuildings, the cleared land stretched almost to the horizon. It was bordered by the creek on one side, and on the other, a wall of thick, tangled bush. Mrs. Ives tipped water from a bucket into a pot, then leaned over the fire and slowly raked out the embers. The ridge of her spine showed through her bodice, and she had difficulty lifting the pot onto the hook above the fire. When she went out to empty the teapot, I glanced across the hallway and saw a doorway opening into what looked like a study. A leather chair had been pulled up to a desk that was stacked with books and papers. "I'm afraid I have no milk," Mrs. Ives said as she returned. She reached for a tea canister on the mantelpiece, scooped out some tea, and tipped it into the pot. "The cow ran into the bush I can't remember how long ago it was." To relieve her awkwardness, I said, "I'm used to drinking my tea black." She nodded, took down a small silver bowl from the mantelpiece, and banged it several times upon the table. Hundreds of ants swarmed up the sides to escape. Mrs. Ives then stabbed the hardened sugar with a spoon to loosen it. From the dresser beside the door she took cups and saucers embellished with pink roses. She lifted the lid from a round tin, and a moth flew out. She ignored it, and arranged crumbling biscuits on a plate. When the tea was ready, I followed Mrs. Ives down the hall. As we reached the parlour, she asked, "What's the matter with your foot?" "I cut it on a rock a few days ago. I don't think it's anything serious." That wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough. There was another desk in the parlour, upon which the inkwell was capped, and the nibs arranged in a row. It was the only surface in the room clear of dust. Even the unfinished piece of embroidery on the footstool had a film over it. Mrs. Ives turned the pot and poured the tea. Her hands were long, their movements graceful. "Where in England are you from?" I asked. "Bristol. I came out here with my sister to visit our brother. He was a lieutenant in Perth. I met Mr. Ives on the ship. When my sister returned to England, my brother and his wife went with her. I'm quite alone, you see." The words rushed out, bitter. I dug sugar from the bowl and dropped it into my tea. It was delightful to hear the clink of a teaspoon against china again. "And yourself?" Mrs. Ives asked, reaching for the plate of biscuits. "I was born in Adelaide. My mother died when I was 4, so I live with my father. He was a captain in the Navy, though now retired." "So how do you come to be this far from home?" "My father and I are writing a book on wildflowers, and I'm collecting and illustrating specimens. I'm on my way north to see the everlasting daisies. They grow in this area too. but I've heard that up there the displays are spectacular. How did you get here? I sailed to Albany with my horses. Then I rode. Mrs. Ives frowned. You rode? Yes. She blinked, then offered me a biscuit. I was reluctant to take one, having seen the moth, but I didn't wish to offend. I bit into it cautiously. It was stale and floury. I swallowed it down with a mouthful of tea. Mrs. Ives' gaze fell upon the floor, and I guessed that I'd unnerved her. Does your husband run cattle or sheep? I asked. She returned her eyes to my face. Cattle. Do you know of the Clarkson expedition to the northwest? I've heard of it. They're opening up the north for grazing. Yes. There was no feed for the cattle here because of the drought. So my husband added his own stock to the expeditions and left me here. He's been gone for 7 months. Again there was that note of bitterness. This, then, accounted for the neglect of her person, but not for the absence of servants, nor for the dust and disarray in the rooms. Where are your servants? I asked. I dismissed one. The other ran away. Her face hardened. I tried to think of something else to say, but Mrs. Ives spoke first. How do you get by, then, travelling alone? I have a shotgun, and I know some of the natives' languages. I'm resilient and careful. I watch for things. She shook her head, disbelieving. I can scarcely comprehend it. How long now have you been away? I calculated the time. 4 months. Good heavens! All that time outdoors? She looked at me as if I were mad. I was accustomed to such a response, but I didn't expect to see the hint of wonder in her eyes that followed. Her good manners came to the fore, and she said politely, I wish that Mrs. Sorrel, our neighbour on the southern side, were home. She's a great traveller. But she always goes with her husband. The Hawkings are on the other side. Mrs. Hawking is tiresome, but her daughter Margaret is pleasant, and borrows many of my books. How interesting, I replied, although now I wasn't interested at all. A sudden wave of weariness had engulfed me. I no longer cared about Mrs. Ives. I merely wanted to set up my tent and sleep. As your husband isn't here, I said, after draining my teacup, might I ask your permission to travel through the property? I'd like to camp by the Vassar. How can you go anywhere with an injured foot? It's not that bad. You are limping heavily. Well, it has become a little worse since last night, I admitted. Allow me to have a— No, it's quite all right. Her lips thinned again, and I felt uneasy. I couldn't predict what she would do if I went against her wishes. Well, another opinion won't hurt. I unlaced my boot and tried to pull off my stocking, but it had stuck to the wound. I was about to grit my teeth and tear it away, but Mrs. Ives said, That won't come off unless you soften it with water. There's still some left in the pot. I'll boil it again. When she returned, I noticed with relief that she'd cleaned her hands and nails. She dropped a cloth into the pan of hot water and squeezed it over the stocking. When the fabric was soaking, she gripped my ankle and carefully peeled the material away. Her cool hands were a comfort. for my soul was hot with inflammation. We peered at the wound. The skin around the gash was tight and swollen, so that it looked like two red lips. Mrs. Ives touched one side lightly, and pus welled out. "I don't think you'll be going far on that. You'd better stay here and see the doctor in the morning." I wanted to be on my way, but I could see that the wound was worse, and that it would take longer to heal if I continued to walk on it. I was also badly fatigued, and the thought of an undisturbed night was delicious. "Very well, I'll stay here tonight." And at that point, MDF, we are on page 13 in case I forget. I think I shall leave it there. There's, what is it Jessica says a few pages ago? About a sudden wave of tiredness engulfed me. I can't find it now. Yes, it's not really tiredness. Yes, it is tiredness, I'll admit it. So I'll stop. I could read, well, I hope I will. I really want to read much more of that. It's just brilliant. And I did have things to say to you, to add on to the end, but I've, of course, forgotten them all. Anyway, my voice is starting to go rather husky, so I shall stop there. Hope that this file isn't now so large that, I don't know, it makes Google explode or something. I've been getting incredibly slow upload speeds recently, so this might be visible in about 12 hours time. I don't know. I'll let you know as soon as it comes through. You take really good care of yourself, and please don't hesitate to get in touch for any reason. Bye bye.